Hey friends, it's Jessica from Three Rivers Homestead, and I'm back with another video in the 2025 Every Bit Counts Challenge. This is the food preservation challenge we do every August where we purpose to preserve something every day, no matter how small. And in this video, I'm going to bring you more projects that we were able to accomplish on our homestead this week, and we're going to do a lot of projects in one video. It doesn't take 20 minutes to teach you how to can one item. We are going to pack as much into this as we possibly can. So if that interests you, why don't you stick around? We are seeing a transition here on the crops that are available on our homestead. So a lot of the things like cucumbers have already lived out their lifespan, and now we're starting to see tomatoes and peppers trickle in. So I'm going to focus on some of those projects in this week's video. We also have harvested all of our garlic and onions, so I've been able to start doing some canning projects with meat and broths that involve those items. So we are going to do pickled banana peppers, we're going to do some pizza sauce, we're going to do a spicy chicken, and I'm also going to do quarts of what I call a roast, a beef roast base that I use when I make a roast in the crock pot, and we're also going to harvest some seeds. So let's get started. Banana peppers are typically the first pepper that reaches maturity around here, and in a previous video, I think a couple weeks ago, I showed you how we were making lacto-fermented banana peppers, but this week I just decided to do a small batch of pickled peppers. Now the process would be the same for any type of pepper variety. I did put a bay leaf in the bottom of each jar. That does help with crispiness. The tannins in that will help just like it does with pickles. And then I added about a half a teaspoon of salt per jar, and now I'm just doing a quarter of a teaspoon of turmeric. The turmeric is not for flavoring or anything, it's just for color. When you purchase pickled banana peppers in the store, they often add a yellow food dye to make them look more appealing. If I showed you a jar of pickled peppers without the turmeric or food dye added to them, they do kind of not look as appealing in the jar. And so it's just a simple step. Sometimes I do it, sometimes I don't, but if I have the turmeric on hand, we'll go ahead and add a little bit of that to the jar, and you'll see after these jars are done the color that is produced. And I'm just chopping the peppers into little slices. We will primarily use these as a topping on pizza, or sometimes on our burritos or tacos. It's just a really easy way to preserve these peppers and use them later on. If we weren't going to pickle them, we could also put them in the dehydrator or the freeze dryer and make a banana pepper powder that we could use to spice up things like chili and things like that. For these peppers, I am just putting straight vinegar into the jar. Since we're pickling these in the water bath, they do need to have a vinegar brine of some sort. You could add sugar, you could dilute your vinegar with water. Since these are spicy pepper, I don't mind having the full strength of the vinegar, and that vinegar does ensure that these are safe to be water bath canned. We're just going to get the rims of those jars wiped up so that we get a good seal on our lids. That's an important step. Wiping your rims also helps you ensure there are no cracks in the glass that could prevent a seal. And then we're going to add our lids. These are 4 jars canning lids, and they're my favorite canning lids. If you would like to get 10% off some lids, check out the link in the video description and use my code 3rivers10, and you can get 10% off whenever you need to restock on some lids for your canning projects. So I'm just going to give these a little shake, and then we're going to get them in the water bath. They're going to process for 10 minutes. And when we're done, we have a beautiful small batch of pickled peppers. Every little bit counts. It's 4 more jars headed to the pantry shelves. I needed to clear some space out of a freezer, so I decided to grab 3 packages of beef soup bones. These are from some beef heifers that we had processed last fall, and they're just kind of sitting there, and I want to turn them into broth. My baby is at the stage where she has been drinking bone broth as one of her first foods outside of breast milk, and so I can never have enough broth going in the kitchen. And since I was making a big stock pot of it, I decided that we would use some of this broth in a canning project. So the bones simmered in just plain water because my baby has her broth plain at this point. We made it plain, and it simmered for, I don't know, maybe 10 hours that day. And at the end of the day, then I was able to ladle out the broth. We're going to stick this in the fridge overnight, and that will allow the fat that's in the broth to kind of rise to the top and create a solid fat cap that then we can pull off and use that tallow for something else later on, and then have no fat in our broth that we're creating for this canning recipe. So the next day I was ready to start canning. I grabbed some onions and some garlic, and we're going to go ahead and get busy and start chopping these up. So I'm definitely not opposed to having fat in my broth, but if your broth is too fatty that you're canning, that grease can potentially siphon out and then put a greasy layer on the rims and affect the seal of your canning product. So I do try to use less fat in the broths that I do can. And I also know that I'm going to end up pouring this base over a beef roast that's in the crock pot. And that roast is already going to have a lot of fat in it that's going to cook down. And so it just didn't feel necessary to use the fat in this product. So we got our onions and our garlic all peeled up here. I'm using some of the smaller onions that we harvested that aren't going to be as good for storage. I love to use those small onions up in my canning projects throughout the month of August and September. And my food processor is actually broken. It's been broken for a while, and so I just kind of am using what I have, which is an immersion blender. We're just going to make kind of a slurry out of the onion and garlic. It's all going to get mixed up. It's in there for flavor, not aesthetic or anything, so it doesn't matter how it looks. The immersion blender did a great job of chopping all that up for me and saved me and my eyes from crying as I had to chop all of that onion. Now we're going to add our flavorings to each of our quart jars. I'm putting bay leaves in the bottom. You could add any herbs that you would like for your beef roast flavorings. I find that some fresh herbs, the taste doesn't can well, so I'm going to wait and add herbs later on. I'm just doing the bay leaves, and then I put about approximately a fourth a cup of Worcestershire sauce in the bottom of each jar. Let me know if I said that properly. Sometimes I don't. And then I put a teaspoon of salt in each jar, and now we're just going to divide that onion and garlic evenly between each of these jars here. Now, the reason that you have a lot of freedom in making something like this is because the canning recipe times are the same for any soup. It's 75 minutes for quarts of soup. That's whether you have meat or beans or vegetables like the onion and garlic here in your soup. They are all going to can for 75 minutes in a pressure canner. So I have a lot of liberty here in putting whatever herbs and salt or flavorings that I want in these jars. They're all going to process for the same amount of time. So do whatever you want here. If you want to add herbs, if you want to add something spicy, whatever flavors you want to have on your beef roast in the future, you could put in this jar here. And then when you go to make a roast, all you have to do is sear the roast, put it in your crock pot, and dump this jar over the top, and you'll have great flavor. I will probably add a little bit of fresh herb to the crock pot later on to avoid killing a lot of that flavor in the pressure canner. Remember that broth can be greasy, so you do want to clean your jars, get your lids on, and then like I said, these are going to go into the pressure canner and process for 75 minutes. You start that time, the 75 minutes, when the pressure reaches whatever it should be at your altitude, which for me here in Northwest Ohio, we're going to process these at 10 psi. And we're going to get that going. These were cold because the broth was cold coming out of the fridge, so I did put cold water that matched the temperature of the jars into the canner. That's really important. If you were using the boiling hot broth in your jar, you would want to make sure the water you put in the canner matches the temperature of that broth and is hot. That's how you're going to avoid jars cracking in your canner. Moving on to the next project, I had just a small batch here of tomatoes to use up, and so I had some chicken that I wanted to can up. So I decided I was going to make some spicy chicken, and the first step in doing this is making a tomato juice. So I started by washing all of these beautiful homegrown tomatoes, and getting the cores removed and any bad spots removed. I put them in a pot and just put a little bit of water in the bottom so that they didn't scorch, and started heating them up. And then eventually I grabbed the immersion blender, and we are going to blend these down with the peels. And the reason I feel safe doing that is because it's going to be pressure canned. That I wouldn't want to water bath these with the peels if I'm going to follow normal canning guidelines, but since these are going to be pressure canned with chicken for 90 minutes, any bacteria on those peels is going to be killed during that pressure canning process. So we got this all cooked down a little bit, and then I can move on to the other ingredients in my jars, which once again, what we have right now to use up are banana peppers, onion, and garlic. So just like with the soup recipe, you have a lot of liberty in canning meat products. It's considered soup if less than half of the jar is full of meat, and you would process that item for 75 minutes. But if you're going to have more than half of the jar full of meat, which is the case with this item that I'm canning, then it's considered a meat product and has to be processed for 90 minutes in the pressure canner. It doesn't matter if that meat is canned with vegetables. It doesn't matter if it's just in water or if it has a tomato base. All of those items are going to be processed for 90 minutes. So that gives you a lot of liberty in changing up the flavorings. You can add whatever spices you want here. Add onion, don't add onion, add garlic. You can add any type of banana pepper. It doesn't matter. It's just as long as the jar is going to be more than half full of meat, you're going to need to process these for 90 minutes. And so I encourage you to look to the National Center for Home Food Preservation. If you go to their website, their guidelines for canning meat and canning vegetable soups or meat soups are all explained there. So we put the onion, garlic, and banana pepper in the jars, and now I'm adding a teaspoon of cumin to each jar. I'm also going to do a teaspoon of paprika and a teaspoon of salt in each jar. If you wanted this to be super spicy, go ahead and add something a little hotter than that, maybe some cayenne pepper, but my children don't necessarily love it super spicy, so the banana pepper will be enough for us. I chunked up some chicken, and then I'm just filling the jars, kind of dividing that evenly between everything here. My plan for these jars will be single serving foods for my teenage boys who have been missing meals due to their work and school schedules. And so they'll be able to warm up a jar of this. We could make burritos with it, or they could pour it over some rice. It'll just make a super quick meal for them. And then once I was ready, I could ladle my tomato juice that we had cooked down earlier in the day over the top of the chicken. You're going to want to make sure to take something like a chopstick and stir it around to release any air bubbles that are trapped between the chicken. And you can see how the head space decreased when I did that. So I'm going back to refill to maintain 1-inch head space. Then I'm going to wipe my rims as usual. You guys know the process. We're going to add our lids, we're going to add our rings, and we're going to get these in the pressure canner for 90 minutes, like I said, because that is how you would safely pressure can meat products. So when I want to use these, I would drain the liquid out into whatever rice I was cooking, and then I would take the vegetables and meat and serve it over the top of that, or drain it out, make the rice, and then put the rice and the veggies and meat inside of a tortilla to make a chicken burrito. And my boys are going to love this. I'll be really grateful that I made these this winter when I'm coming up with quick meals for them. I didn't use all of my tomato sauce in that project. I had a little bit left, so I'm going to cook it down to thicken it up. And I added oregano, garlic, and I added citric acid to make a pizza sauce. Because I added the citric acid, this is going to be acidic enough to safely water bath can, even with the peels on it. And so I'm going to make these in little quarter pints of pizza sauce, because these will once again be great for meals for my boys. I've been making them homemade pizza pockets, and it's usually, I don't need to open a whole jar just to make them a couple pizza pockets. So I thought these little quarter pints would be great for the days when I want to make that for them and not open a huge jar. So I'm thinking a lot about convenient meals for my big boys this summer. These jars were water bath canned for 35 minutes. Now, I had a few days where I needed super easy projects because I didn't have time to do any canning. So we're focused on saving some seed this week. Coriander seed is the seed of the cilantro plant. Here in the States, we call the leaves cilantro and the seeds coriander. And it is a culinary seed that you will use in some recipes. We can also save these seeds to grow more cilantro this fall or next spring. So seed saving is definitely something that you don't want to neglect during food preservation season. Whether it's leaving a couple cucumbers on the vine to over mature and ripen so that you can harvest the seeds, or if you have some really amazing tomatoes that were massive and huge, save the seeds from that item in order to grow more tomatoes like that in future years. Saving the seed that will grow next year's food in the garden is just as important as preserving the food from this year's garden to get you through the winter. So there is a focus on that, and there is a book that I recommend, and I'm going to link it in the video description. It taught me everything I know about saving seed if you want a really good tutorial, because every plant has a different method for saving seed. Some of them are really simple like this, where you just let it dry on the plant outside and then harvest it after it's dry. But there are some wetter items where the seed is inside of it, like peppers or tomatoes or cucumbers, where that seed might need to be fermented or prepared in a different way to be stored and able to germinate at a later date. So these we're saving mostly as a culinary item. I have a few recipes that do call for coriander seed, and so I'm grateful to fill up my little jar here and get that in my spice cabinet to be used throughout the winter. If you're interested in more seed saving content, let me know and I can dedicate an entire video to how I do that for various food items at a later date. Speaking of saving seed, this week we also took an opportunity to store the garlic that I harvested a few videos back in a video and that had been curing down in our root cellar. To get it ready for storage, there's a little work that needs to be done. We're chopping off all of the stalks and cutting off any of the dirty roots and then removing the outer layer of paper, I guess, that's around the garlic that might have any mud or dirt on it. Just cleaning those up a little bit. And then some years I put these in bags to store, but I found that it was much more convenient last year if I just had them in a big basket that I would put down in the root cellar, and then I could come down and just grab a couple cloves at a time. I don't often need a whole bag of garlic upstairs in the way that I prefer to store my onions. But we're not just preparing this garlic for eating, we're also preparing it for seed for the garden. In October, it will be time for us to plant garlic for next year's garden. And many years I don't grow enough garlic to plant what we harvested, and I will order seed from a good family friend, and that's what we'll plant. But this year I grew some really amazing large bulbs, and I'll show you one here. And so I feel confident that if I plant some of these really amazing large bulbs, the cloves of that we could not have to buy seed this year and be completely self-sufficient in our garlic, which is really exciting. It's been a few years since I've been able to do that. So here's our garlic harvest. And between what we already have frozen and freeze-dried and pickled from last year, this is going to be more than enough garlic for my canning recipes and all of the cooking that I'll need to do over the winter, as well as planting for next year. So those were all of the projects that I accomplished this week. I did do some repeat projects from last week because we had more blackberries coming in, so I did can a little more jam. But since I've already shared that recipe, I'm trying not to do repeat items in this video. So if you don't see 7 projects in a weekly video, that is why, because I don't want to waste your time and repeat something that I just showed you the week before. Other than that, we've just been busy on the homestead preparing other things for winter. We're getting ready to bring in and harvest firewood and get that all stacked. That's an important task that we have to do. Working on securing hay for our beef heifers for the winter. and also just finishing up other chores around the place. The garden is still producing. It's producing new wonderful items, and I'm working on getting the fall garden planted, and so I'll bring some of that to you in future videos. I hope all of you guys are following along with the Every Bit Counts Challenge and enjoying all of this preservation content. We will be back next week with more. Have a blessed week, friends. Goodbye.